Welcome everyone to our program on cultural heritage protection and preservation in the aftermath of the war in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. Our program is organized by the Armenian Bar Association here in the United States in collaboration for the first time with 5 other organizations, the Associations of Armenian Lawyers in Argentina, Germany, Britain, France, and Russia. We are very pleased to welcome so many people from around the world to discuss this important topic. In recent months, among the many devastating effects of the war, we have also seen the pictures of destroyed or desecrated churches or destroyed antiquities, including centuries-old khachkars. Just this week, as we were preparing for this program, we became aware of a BBC report that showed another church being destroyed. We all have many questions about what can be done and what is being done to preserve and protect the rich history of Artsakh. Our program today will try to dive into these questions. Our program will have 3 parts, and we are very lucky to have 4 very knowledgeable experts with us today. Our first speaker, Professor Heghnar Watenpaugh, will give us an overview of cultural heritage in Artsakh to try to sketch for us what is at stake. Our 2 next speakers, Fionnuala Rogers and Till Veer Hodge, will help us understand the legal framework for some of the issues that typically arise with respect to cultural property and art during and after conflicts. Our final speaker, Mr. Artur Hakobyan, will be going over some of the efforts by Armenia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs to raise awareness and seek protection at the international level, including through UNESCO. Time permitting, we will try to have a Q&A session at the end. We welcome questions typed in the Q&A function in Zoom. As a reminder also, if you are a member of the California Bar, the program can count for a 1-hour CLE requirement. We have a packed schedule, so let's start with our first speaker. Professor Heghnar Watenpaugh is a professor of art history at the University of California, Davis. Her field is the history of art in the Middle East. She is the author of an award-winning book on Aleppo. Her new book, The Missing Pages, was widely acclaimed and is the first book to receive prizes from both the Society for Armenian Studies and the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. Among her many fellowships and awards, Professor Watenpaugh has recently been named a fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation and a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. Professor Watenpaugh has conducted extensive field research in Syria, Turkey, and Armenia. She is part of an international working group of experts dedicated to the preservation of cultural heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh. Professor Watenpaugh, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Talin, and thank you to you and your colleagues for organizing this. I'm going to share my screen. If Krikor, you could enable me to share my screen, that would be great. Thank you. I want to begin this presentation by recalling my colleague in Artsakh, Professor Vahram Lalayan, who's a professor of medieval history and theology and a defender of cultural heritage in Karabakh. And he died in his home during the war. When we talk about what is happening in Karabakh and what is cultural heritage, I first want to make clear that I'm, as Talin mentioned, I am part of an international working group of scholars, cultural heritage professionals, activists, preservationists, and journalists. And much of what I'm going to present is their work, and I will try to acknowledge that whenever I can. Let me also begin by saying a few things about what cultural heritage is. I myself am an art historian who is interested in cultural heritage. Art history and cultural heritage are slightly different things. Cultural heritage is the phenomenon, the many disciplines that go into caring for the past and presenting it in the present, making it meaningful in the present. It encompasses anything from archaeology, historic preservation, architecture, engineering, in addition to art history, curatorship, museology, and conservation. So when we're talking about the area of Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh and surrounding regions, we're talking about a region that is extraordinarily rich in the heritage of culture from many centuries ago. I'm showing you images from Tikranagerd, which is an archaeological site that dates primarily from the Hellenistic period, about the 1st century BC. And it also has a significant early Christian period that was made manifest when excavations were conducted under the leadership of Professor Hamlet Petrosyan of Yerevan State University. Tikranagerd is an Aldam district, one of the districts that came under the jurisdiction of the Azerbaijani military after the agreement in November. Tikranagerd is a site that is interesting and important in and of itself, but it also presents some of the vulnerabilities that many archaeological sites have. It had a museum on site. You're seeing an image of it here. We know that during the war, there was shelling in the excavation area and the museum. The current state of the museum, its contents, and the archaeological site as a whole is not entirely clear. This is an example of the possibility, the danger that objects that are whole or that are on site can become untethered from their site and can enter networks or circulation. We're talking about the widespread phenomenon of looting of archaeological sites that we've seen in so many places, from the United States to Italy, and notably more recently in Iraq and Syria. So Tikranagerd worries us because of that possibility. And many of the objects, the Hellenistic and early Christian period materials uncovered at Tikranagerd are particularly desirable on the international art market. The Karabakh also obviously has a very rich early Christian heritage. And I'm showing you a map drawn by Patrick Donabedian and his colleagues in their work on the medieval heritage of Karabakh. This includes literally thousands of sites that have been documented for years by scholars, beginning in the Soviet period and more intensively during the independence period. I'm showing you a 5th, 6th century early Christian basilica, Dzizernavank, that is now very close to the Lachin corridor and falls in the area. It's close to the area that's under the jurisdiction of Russian peacekeepers, but it is not under the jurisdiction of Russian peacekeepers. And again, the fate of this site is unknown. In addition to buildings and architectural complexes, we're also concerned about individual carvings or objects. And I'm showing you a khachkar from the late 12th, early 13th century from the monastery of Handabert in Kalbajar district, also currently under the jurisdiction of the Azerbaijani military. This khachkar was studied by Hamlet Petrosyan, and there's a recent article about this by Christina Moranci in the art site Hyperallergic. This khachkar is very important because it contains, as you can see here, what is probably the earliest depiction of lactating virgin type in Armenian art, a mother breastfeeding her child. So we have just begun to really understand the depth and richness of the art historical tradition of medieval Artsakh, thanks to the work of Christina Moranci and others. And Christina Moranci has been calling this process emergency art history, when we are forced by the circumstances to devote ourselves to an area of study with very little resources at our disposal. But one thing I want to point out to you from the point of view of cultural heritage is that these sites and these objects are not only important for art historical reasons, they are also important because they are part of a living heritage, a living practice of religion. You can see on this khachgar, there are remnants of candle wax. That's because people pray here, or people prayed here until recently, until they were displaced. So these are not simply works of art. These are objects that are part of a very complex religious universe. These are places and objects around which very intense religious experiences take place. And part of the tragedy is that when the communities are cut off from their places of worship, that world of the religious universe and intangible heritage is denied to them. So that is too a concern of cultural heritage. We are not only talking about tangible objects and buildings, however beautiful and however important for art history, we are also talking about practices of society, their religious and cultural traditions. I want to bring to your attention a recent article by my colleague Simon Mahakian, again in the art website Hyperallergic, where Simon builds on the research of others to talk about, to bring attention to a site like this. This is the Hachendorbatli Mausoleum near Agdam, so again, also under Azerbaijani jurisdiction. This is an Islamic site, a beautiful mausoleum. And as Simon and his colleagues have pointed out, it has very close formal and stylistic relationships to the site, the Holy Virgin Church in Yerevan in present-day Republic of Armenia. And these are photographs taken by Research on Armenian Architecture, an NGO based in Yerevan that for decades has been documenting all types of cultural heritage, Armenian, Islamic, and other throughout Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and also in present-day Turkey. So I also want to call attention to the work of research on Armenian architecture that has been ongoing for decades and sort of has been unsung, but now we really are appreciating how important the work is that they have done, and everything we're doing now has to rely on their research. So the point in comparing these two structures is that they not only have very close formal similarities, and I'm showing you comparisons of features that even to an untrained eye look very similar treatments of thresholds, consisting with these star patterns and mukharnas or honeycomb type way of decorating niches. We see very similar kinds of animal imagery in both cases. And there is evidence that the two structures were actually created by the same architect, a person named Shahik, who was most probably an Armenian. So these similarities point to the fact that the medieval heritage of this period is very rich, and it is very artificial now to separate and politicize what is Armenian and what is Azerbaijani heritage. A more universal view of heritage would be one where each site and every period in the biography of a site is given the attention that it is due, and living communities that practice their religion or have other religious practice or cultural and religious practices at a site are also allowed to perform these activities. Probably the crown jewel of the medieval heritage of the Karabakh region is Dadivang, a monastic complex in the Kalbajar district. The buildings and their decoration date from the 9th and 13th centuries, But Dadivang is especially important because it houses an entire monastic community and with all of its different buildings, including kitchen, refectory, library, in addition to churches and mausolea. So it's a unique opportunity for one to really get a sense of all of the aspects of a medieval monastic community that has remained intact up until today. Dadivang is also notable because it has a special chapel that houses these two khachkars dating from 1283 that are considered masterpieces of medieval carving. And I want to emphasize again, thanks to this beautiful photograph by New York photographer Scout Tufangjian, who was in Artsakh right after the war and was able to document many aspects during that time. Dadivang is a living center of Armenian Christianity, a very important one, with a resident monastic community. And what we're seeing here is a ceremony of baptism. The Dadivang is today in Kalbajar district, and therefore it is under Azerbaijani military control. But by agreement, it is now protected by Russian peacekeepers for now. Monks and priests remain, and they continue their liturgical activities. However, access for worshippers and pilgrims is dangerous. It's difficult. It requires several levels of permissions, and there have been reports that access for religious purposes to the site has been curtailed. It is also of concern that the village near Dadivang that was part of its this complex and helped to support the activities at Dadivang, the community living there had to be displaced. So the local community and the practice of Armenian Christianity at the site has already been harmed. And while many see the presence of Russian peacekeepers as a guarantee of that the Dadivang will not be destroyed, I do want to use these photographs taken by journalists to show that there are military installations at the site right now. And I don't know what the conservation implications of those installations are going to be. We are also facing, as many of you know, a campaign coming from the highest levels of the Azerbaijani government. Here is a tweet from the Minister of Culture of the Republic of Azerbaijan that present a narrative of the cultural history of this region that is counter to any factual art history that I know. It's an attempt to present some of the masterpieces of medieval architecture here, not as Armenian, but as Caucasian Albanian. The Caucasian Albanians are a medieval group that existed and were active in this region. But this narrative denies and minimizes and aims to erase the presence of Armenian Christianity and Armenian culture and literature in this region. And we are especially concerned about anything that indexes Armenianness and Christianity, including inscriptions in the Armenian alphabet, because we know that in the past, those types of signs that index Armenianness have been targeted for erasure in Azerbaijan. As you all know, many international heritage organizations have made statements and are of concern about the dangers to Armenian cultural heritage in Karabakh. And I know that many of you are going to talk about UNESCO, and so I won't talk about that too much. But I was asked to talk about what is being done. And one of the projects that's underway that I want to highlight is a project initiated by the Avocats Foundation based in New York State that has a number of projects to monitor heritage destruction and appropriation in the entire region. And Avocats Foundation is especially making use of high-resolution satellite imagery that is publicly available. It is extremely expensive and requires a great deal of effort to obtain and to process and to truly understand. But they have begun this project with partial funding from AGBU. And if you want more information on that, the website of the Avocats Foundation is on the screen. The team is led by Professor Lori Khachadurian at Cornell University, supported by archaeologists from Purdue University and Cornell. I want to say a few words about the city of Shushi, which is also under Azerbaijani control. And I want to emphasize that Shushi is a city that has many layers and many types of cultural heritage. Of course, the Hazanchetots Cathedral dominates the skyline of the city. It was built in this form in the second half of the 19th century. This is just before the war. And one of the most striking sights during the war was the shelling of the cathedral twice in one day on October 8, 2020, at a time where civilians, including journalists, were in the building. The Hazanchetots Cathedral, Holy Savior Cathedral, stands as a symbol of the danger that cultural heritage suffers right now, especially any type of cultural heritage that indexes Armenianness or Christianity. Shushi, of course, also has a deep Islamic history, and this is the Govhar Mosque from the late 18th century. This is a photograph before its restoration, and it was restored by the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic in 2019. And at its own expense, as an unrecognized republic, Artsakh did not have access to international funding. And I want to emphasize that the Republic of Artsakh did go through lengths to protect the cultural heritage of all groups under its territory. Maybe it was not perfect, and here I want to echo a tweet by Simon Mahakian, where he says, have Armenian authorities in Artsakh done their 100% to properly preserve all Azerbaijani heritage? Probably not. Have Azerbaijani authorities in Nakhichevan done 100% to erase all Armenian heritage? Yes. And unfortunately, the recent report about the destruction of the church that we heard from the BBC yesterday is very concerning about what will happen to Artsakh. Another project I want to highlight that is underway is a project called Living Artsakh. That seeks to gather, it's headed by Ani Kasparian and Tamar Boyajian and many other colleagues. And the idea is to highlight voices, literature, and intangible heritage from Artsakh. And to illustrate this, what I'm showing you are two publications from the Armenian language publications printed in Shushi. One is a book printed in 1839, and the other one is a newspaper called Karabakh. And this is from the first year of the newspaper, 1911. So we have a very deep, not only cultural heritage in terms of beautiful buildings and masterpieces and khachkars and objects, but also literature, folklore, all kinds of cuisine, and all kinds of other living and ever evolving cultural heritage that should also be part of the conversation. And my final point is that one type of cultural heritage that exists in the region and that gets forgotten by everyone is the cultural heritage of the Soviet period. Karabakh, I'm showing you a monument to the Second World War that is located near Shushi, about at the entrance. I'm sure many of you have visited it. And Karabakh, in fact, was famous among modern architecture enthusiasts because Soviet architecture has been preserved in Karabakh without much change. So it was considered a place to go if you really wanted to see examples of Soviet architecture, sort of untouched or barely touched by years of independence and more recent development. And what the hope is that modern architecture can be seen as an example of cultural heritage that should not be politicized and should not be used as a form of revenge or punishment of the targeted group, but rather a type of heritage that is part of the experience of all the countries in the South Caucasus and can perhaps be a medium for common interests, a medium for celebration, and perhaps even dialogue, including all local stakeholders. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Watenpaugh, for that excellent presentation, and also for emphasizing and turning our focus to the living nature of the sites. I think that's something, such an important thing to remember. Thank you for also educating us about some of the important projects that are underway. We really appreciate it. Let's turn to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Fionnuala Rogers. She is an art and cultural property lawyer and specializes in advice in relation to cultural property and heritage, including preservation, national and international legal obligations, and prevention of illicit trafficking. Fionnuala is also the chair of the UK National Committee for the Blue Shield and a member of the Blue Shield's Illicit Trafficking Working Group. Her work at the Blue Shield is focused on protecting cultural property during conflict and natural disaster. Fionnuala works with heritage professionals, governments, and the art market in relation to cultural heritage, and is regularly consulted on draft law, policy, and heritage protection measures around the world. Thank you, Fionnuala, for joining us. Can you start by giving an overview of the main laws around protection of cultural property and what the obligations are?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that introduction, Talene, as well. And I should just say that my comments today, given we're talking about national and international law, are from me as a cultural property lawyer, not necessarily speaking on behalf of the Blue Shield, but of course, some of the most relevant laws we're going to talk about today are actually the reason the Blue Shield exists. So there's certainly a lot of overlap there. So there's a lot of international law going back, decades and over 100 years actually, on the laws of armed conflict and protection of religious sites and heritage. So I'll run through them very briefly, and then we can sort of have a look at how they apply. So there were originally the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, and they were the first conventions that established the principle that cultural heritage and religious art and scientific sites had to be protected during conflict and that they shouldn't be used for military purposes. Moving on from that, the Hague Convention of 1954 widened the scope significantly. So it widened the scope of cultural property and the definitions. So these protections actually apply to a much wider remit of heritage. But they also, importantly, brought in an obligation to protect cultural heritage during peacetime, because the threshold for conflict can actually be quite high, particularly when you get into occupation and whether it's an international conflict or not. So having these peacetime obligations actually means that these protections apply a lot more often than previously. We also have the Geneva Conventions, which give protection to religious sites as well as schools, and some artistic objects. But the problem with the Geneva Convention and its two protocols is that, again, it only applies during conflict. So whilst it's very, very helpful to protect religious buildings and heritage sites during a conflict, they mustn't be used for military occupation. It is only in the circumstances of conflict. So as soon as the fighting stopped, even post-conflict, it no longer applies. There are other conventions that are very relevant. So we have the 1970 Unesco Convention, which focuses on cultural objects, movable objects, being illegally removed from their country of origin. So this is to do with trafficking and sort of export of cultural property. And my colleague Till will talk a little bit more about that, but just to flag that that convention also applies in peacetime. It's not relevant, not necessarily only relevant to conflict. Something that was touched on in the first presentation was the intangible cultural heritage, which is also something that's very, very important. And there is a 2003 convention, the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, which requires state parties to safeguard intangible heritage in their territories and ensure respect for it at all times. That also applies in peacetime, that states are required to make sure this is protected. There's also the World Heritage Convention, which I think a lot of participants will be familiar with, which applies during peacetime, but that is only relevant to certain types of cultural heritage and heritage sites that are internationally recognized as World Heritage Sites. And then finally, there is the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court. Now, a recent decision in 2016 in the case of Mali actually determined that deliberate destruction of cultural heritage during conflict was a war crime. The difficulty with the Rome Statute, and why I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, is that actually neither Armenia or Azerbaijan are signatories to that. So the remedies available in the International Criminal Court don't actually apply to the conflict we're talking about today. Armenia and Azerbaijan are both signatories to all of the other conventions that I've discussed. So the Hague Conventions and the two protocols, the 1949 Geneva Convention, the 1970 UNESCO Convention, the 2003 Intangible Heritage Convention, and the World Heritage Convention. So both countries have ratified the majority of the relevant international laws. And Azerbaijan, I'm not speaking as a lawyer qualified in Azerbaijani law, but I have studied it. They actually have two quite detailed national laws that apply in Azerbaijan and in Azerbaijani territory, which protects cultural heritage. And there is quite a wide definition of what counts as cultural heritage. Now, these are fairly recent pieces of legislation, and in reading them, you can tell that they take inspiration from the international conventions. And I would say, impartially reading them, they are quite sophisticated, and they do certainly seem to cover a lot of the issues that the conventions require, which is quite further advanced than a lot of other countries. So I want to just have a look at the difference between the obligations of state parties during conflict and during peacetime, because they are different. Now, under the Hague Convention, when there's a conflict, both parties have to respect the cultural property, and they can't use it for military purposes or purposes that are likely to cause damage or destruction. They're also required to prohibit theft, misappropriation, vandalism, and illicit trafficking of cultural property. So they are quite strict in terms of what they require. Now, the repercussions, it's quite difficult, because with an international treaty, the repercussions of violating those statutes are usually up to the decisions of the other member states to that convention. So in the Hague Convention, for example, there are provisions in there that allow sanctions of the other signatory parties to place against the violating state. What that boils down to in reality is international pressure, because of course when you're dealing with civilians who have destroyed cultural property, you've got law enforcement in the country who will arrest and prosecute. When you're dealing with state to state, it's much more complicated and much more political. The Hague Convention does set out these violations, but it is a decision of multiple member states to decide exactly what action to take. Now, in peacetime, there are still obligations on countries, and they really go down to preparing for conflict and sort of taking preemptive action. So the convention does state that they still have to safeguard cultural property. They're supposed to prepare registers of cultural heritage in the country, regardless of whether it is, the people currently living there or whether it's recognized by another group of people. Because this is one of the things the Hague Convention really encompasses, is that cultural property is for all humankind. It's not just for the citizens of that particular country. You've also got to designate refuges. You're supposed to mark important cultural heritage buildings and monuments with the Blue Shield emblem, and you should have authorities and special units in place to work with the armed forces for natural disaster and conflict. So these are all obligations that both Armenia and Azerbaijan should be taking now, because officially we are in peacetime. It's not considered an international armed conflict at the moment. Previously it would have been, but these obligations apply. Now, I think when it comes to the destruction within the region itself, I think one of the difficulties is that it's what is recognized as cultural property, because when we're talking about the registers, it is actually up to the member state themselves to decide what meets the definition of cultural property in their region. And that's really an evidential question and based on, academia, archaeologists and history. So if things are not registered, it's not necessarily going to be that they're not protected, but it's much more difficult to actually protect them. So I think one of the issues is if registers in Nagorno-Karabakh of cultural heritage don't exist, then it's quite difficult to state that these are protected under the international conventions, because nobody's necessarily recognizing them as cultural heritage. And again, it's all down to political pressure to have other member states recognize these sites and these objects. So I just wanted to give that overview of just sort of to explain the conventions and the complexities at play, and why it's not so easy as just sort of forcing a member state to do something, because there are different interpretations involved, different definitions, and quite a lot of laws overlapping. So I just wanted to set that out as a very brief overview, just to explain the magnitude of the legal framework we're dealing with.
Thank you, Fionnuala. I'll introduce our next speaker, Till, who's going to talk a little bit about another issue that usually arises after conflicts, which is illicit trafficking of artifacts. So Till is an art and cultural property lawyer at Constantine Cannon, and has built up a particular expertise in restitution claims and policy pertaining to art and cultural property, subject to the checkered history of persecution, war, and colonial occupation. Till advises clients on legal, commercial, ethical, and art market-specific aspects of restitution and repatriation claims, including the planning and implementation of PR strategies. In doing so, he works hand in glove with leading provenance researchers. Previously, he spent over 3 years as a public diplomacy officer at the German embassy, advising the German office on the latest political, cultural, and economic developments in the UK. Before that, Till worked as a parliamentary assistant to a UK member of parliament at the House of Commons. So, Till, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tallinn. Pleasure to be here today. And just before I go and dive into the topic of illicit trafficking, I just wanted to add one more consideration to what Fionnuala has just outlined, which is, of course, the sometimes very complex and sometimes slow process of using international and national laws to protect cultural property. I understand how frustrating it is that we have these news stories, such as the one that you've mentioned, Taline, about the church in Artsakh that has somehow disappeared, and stories like that. So I just wanted to add on top of the layer of law, what else state actors can sometimes do. Of course, Fionnuala mentioned it as well, is to try and lobby and drive a PR campaign and use diplomatic, political, and civil society channels where possible to make sure that cultural property is protected by or in territories controlled by hostile nation states. Now, that may not always be possible, or quite certainly isn't possible at the moment in this particular conflict, because when you have two sides to a conflict that are so entrenched and where acts of wanton destruction, looting, spoliation, and even genocide have or potentially have occurred, then is very, very ambitious, of course, to think about cooperation. However, over time, one would hope that one or more of the following channels may be open to bolster the position to be able to protect one's cultural heritage. And of course, the first thing to think about is to engage directly with the political leadership of the other side where possible. Where that is not possible, consider whether there are academic, cultural, museum, or other channels inside the other party's state or civil society that might also be anxious to protect cultural heritage. And I'm just reminded, talking about this, of the beautiful images shown by Dr. Watenpaugh about that mausoleum and the Armenian church, and how similar those two images looked. And that, Fionnuala mentioned as well, that the approach should sometimes be taken, ideally would be taken, that cultural heritage is universal and deserves universal protection. So in that sort of vein, it is sometimes possible to demonstrate to another side that you're making efforts to safeguard their cultural heritage sites on your territory, and hope that that is reciprocated. You could also consider offering access to selected cultural heritage experts from the other side in return for similar access to your own cultural heritage professionals in territories controlled by them. Again, I'm stressing, this is not something that I expect to be possible, remotely possible at the moment, but over time, it might be something that might develop. So if none of that is possible at the moment, you could also consider doing it in a roundabout way, and for instance, consider whether Turkish academics, Turkey being, of course, Azerbaijan's major ally in the region, whether there might be traction there. If that is not possible, then use influence to sort of sway or try and sway supposedly neutral countries with a role to play, such as the Russian peacekeepers, and try and sensitize Russian peacekeepers that they need to keep out for acts of destruction and looting of cultural heritage in the territories that they in particular control. And if not, of course, the most basic layer of these initiatives would be continue lobbying in friendly and allied countries. And just one example from an Armenian perspective that comes to mind is, for instance, that of course the Armenian diaspora in France has successfully convinced the French Assemblée Nationale to criticize Turkey for the genocide against Armenians there. So all of these things could aid the purely legal approach, and one might consider taking matters to the international cultural heritage and art community, and make ongoing efforts like encouraging the incorporation of cultural property protection principles into peacekeeping mandates, alerting governments in the region and more widely to the possibilities of trafficked objects, and engaging and encouraging binational technical cooperation between the two hostile governments, although the latter one, as I said, the most ambitious and at the moment least likely of those potential avenues. Now, in terms of what can be done to avoid looting of objects in territories occupied by a hostile nation state, we often see the situation that there are well-intentioned civilians who are trying to help do that job. And ideally, of course, these civilians would get guidance in such situations from heritage professionals. Maybe, you know, if some of the cultural heritage in question was the property of the church, then the church would be involved in that process. And of course, government officials should ideally would help coordinate a central authority for trying to implement best measures or best practice measures when such well-intentioned civilians seek to protect and preserve cultural property. And I just wanted to give some practical considerations, just headlines of what people would usually look out to be doing in such a situation. So of course, number one is you should do your best to identify the cultural heritage in question, create lists of important sites, make notes of where they are, categorizing the importance of them, maintaining clear inventories of objects that are well-intentionally removed from sites, and also of those left in situ. A second thing would be to record the condition of such cultural heritage as accurately as possible, as found in situ at the time, and digitally store that information, ideally in multiple locations. And another thing that is best practice, certainly in such situations, is to carry out a risk assessment of cultural heritage. And here we usually suggest considering a traffic light system whereby the cultural objects most likely to be in danger of being damaged, destroyed, or looted to be marked red, whereas such sites or such objects that may be deemed worthy of protection even by the hostile nation state might be categorized as a relatively lower risk green category. Everything in between, of course, being amber. And then coming on to gathering evidence and records of the property, of the cultural property, digitizing all records and seeking verification from people who obtained images and other materials. And such documents would include records of restoration work, repairs, and references in archives and literature, and so on. All of this would be underpinned, of course, by a logistical effort. Officials may be needing to assist with the logistics by organizing safe storage of objects, calling on local communities to bring forward objects, and inventorying them all within one central authority. The logistic sides of things would also include identifying conservation and stabilization needs of objects, of movable objects, arranging adequate packaging and storage, even placing dated seals on crates and other storage instruments, so that later it is possible to determine whether they were opened. Photographing such labels and registering all the inventories where possible. And that brings me to my final little subheading of what I'm presenting on, or what I would like to say today, which is, what are the ways of trying to, once cultural property has been spread, of trying to retrieve those items? And one of the main concerns with post-conflict situations is, of course, that objects, as I just outlined, may have been removed by well-intentioned civilians who actually just want to safeguard them, And these might then be at a risk later on of being trafficked because the possessors have no other options of keeping them safe or need to sell the objects. And so by this route, some of these objects may come to market, illicitly, of course. Other objects may come to market as the result of pretty much straight, theft or looting by not so well-intentioned looters and thieves, of course. And sometimes objects originating from recent conflict zones might hit the market right away. Some other times, however, of course, they might be put into storage for many years until nobody has the conflict on their radar anymore, and you can then, sell on such objects at much lower risk in the international market. So in the latter situation, a buyer of an object that has been stored away for many years might in fact acquire legal ownership under the laws of many countries, and in particular under the laws of the country in which the object was purchased, which would then prevent the country of origin from recovering these objects if ownership passes to the buyer. And very often that's the case in scenarios where we have so-called good faith purchasers in the ownership history after a theft took place. So for example, as a matter of English law, if you have a good faith purchase that will extinguish the title of any original owner who suffered a theft after the expiration of 6 years following the good faith purchase. So to put simply, if I own something that is stolen and then sold on to a good faith purchaser, the moment the good faith purchaser buys the object, he doesn't become, under English law, the legal owner of that object. But 6 years after that, I have no longer got a claim to get my object back, and he becomes the legal owner. So the best way of ensuring that doesn't happen, that you cannot argue you are a good faith purchaser, is of course to advertise the fact and circulate the information through the appropriate channels that these objects were potentially stolen. And one way of doing that is using databases of lost art. And one of the most famous databases, the Art Loss Register database, which is a closed database, meaning you don't have open access to it, that registers items that have been stolen or lost or are at risk of being trafficked, such as in conflict, post-conflict, or disaster situations. And the LR will work, the Art Loss Register will work with law enforcement agencies to recover registered objects if they are flagged to them and assist in their return. Another organization that runs a database is Interpol, which operates a similar database, but this is an open database and anyone can search it, which can sometimes be a little bit counterproductive because, of course, those who want to traffic objects can also have a look and then are alerted to what they can sell quite openly and what they have to sell secretly. There are then also red lists, such as the ICOM red lists, which include images of representative types of objects that are likely to have been looted to alert buyers and customs officials if they come across a similar object that they need to increase their scrutiny of such an object, to double check that this object hasn't been of dubious origin and increase their due diligence on that particular object. With that, I think I'm done with this part and would hand the mic back to Tylene.
Thank you, Till. That was very, very interesting. And I'm sure there'll be some questions later. Our final speaker, let me introduce our final speaker, is Mr. Artur Hakobyan. He is the second secretary of the UNESCO and Multilateral Education and Cultural Cooperation Division at the Armenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Hakobyan graduated from the Yerevan State University Faculty of Oriental Studies. He is a specialist in history. He also successfully completed the diplomatic school of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and joined the ministry in 2012. Since then, he has held various posts in the ministry and currently works in the UNESCO and Multilateral Education and Cultural Cooperation Division. The division also functions as the Secretariat of the Armenian National Commission. Since the start of the war, he and his colleagues have been working to raise awareness and advocate for cultural property protection in Nagorno-Karabakh. Mr. Hakobyan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tallinn. It is my pleasure to be here with you all to discuss very important issues related to the cultural heritage protection in Artsakh. I want to extend my gratitude to the Armenian Bar Association and other co-organizers of this online event. Tallinn, Grant, I highly appreciate the work that you are doing towards this end. Our previous speakers spoke about Hague Convention of 1954 and its two protocols, so I won't go into much details about it, just only to say that the convention has two governing bodies, the meetings of state parties and also the Intergovernmental Committee of the Second Protocol. The committee is composed of 12 state parties elected for 4 years, which are eligible for immediate re-election only once. The committee meets once a year in ordinary session and in extraordinary sessions whenever it deems necessary. The committee has some functions to develop guidelines for the implementation of the protocol, to grant, suspend, or cancel enhanced protection for cultural property, to monitor and supervise the implementation of the second protocol, and receive and consider requests for international assistance, and also to perform any other functions which may be assigned to it by the meeting of the parties to the protocol, which is the highest governing body. The Republic of Armenia ratified the second protocol in 2006, and in the same year it entered into force for Armenia. Armenia has been elected a member of the committee for a 4-year term. Our term will last till the next committee meeting, which to be held this December. During the last 15th meeting of the committee in December, my country raised the issue of urgent protection of vast Armenian cultural heritage, churches, monasteries, secular buildings located in the Azerbaijani-controlled territories. Why did we raise this issue and why are we so concerned? During the Azerbaijan large-scale military aggression on Artsakh last year, their forces deliberately targeted the Holy Savior Church in Shushi and inflicted a serious damage to the building. Moreover, after the adoption of the trilateral statement by the Prime Minister of Armenia, Presidents of Russia and Azerbaijan, which ended hostilities, the Azerbaijani military destroyed St. John the Baptist Church in Shushi, which was built in the beginning of the 19th century. Since the signature of the trilateral statement, many videos have been circulating in the social media depicting the acts of vandalism directed at other Armenian monuments, cross stones, khachkars, and grave. I would like to remind you that the Armenian cross stones art is inscribed on the UNESCO representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. And as mentioned by our previous speaker, by Tallinn and Heghnar, that BBC published a report which documented total destruction of the Holy Mother of God Church in Jebrail. And according to a BBC report, the church was intact when Azerbaijan took control of the territory, and now it is razed to the ground. This is how they treat our culture. But the systematic destruction of Armenian heritage has been a well-established policy of the government of Azerbaijan. This policy traces its origins back to the Soviet era, which has been intensified since the independence of that country. The fate of our monuments in Nakhichevan is a stark case in point. Extensive documentary evidence and personal accounts showed that 89 Armenian churches, more than 5,000 cross stones, and 22,000 tombstones were destroyed between 1997 and 2006, including the medieval necropolis of Julfa. Back then, the Azerbaijani government did everything to undermine UNESCO's mission to Nakhichevan, notwithstanding ICOMOS resolution and other specialized international organizations' repeated calls. I do not see any change of the behavior of Baku, and now we are witnessing the same crime being repeated over again. On 15th March, President of Azerbaijan Aliyev visited an Armenian church in Tsakuri village in occupied Hadrut region of Nagorno-Karabakh. And during that visit, he dubbed the church as so-called Caucasian Albanian, baselessly claiming that the Armenian scripts on the wall of the church were fake and should be removed during the planned so-called restoration. It is noteworthy that in the published video, the above-mentioned church has already been vandalized, as the religious symbols had already been removed. No doubt that this move is an explicit order by the president of a UN member state to continue with the large-scale destruction or changing the origin of the Armenian heritage in the region, in a blatant violation of both 1954 Convention and UN Security Council Resolution 2347, adopted in 2017. The government of Azerbaijan overtly violates this resolution either by destroying our heritage or denying its historical Armenian roots, attempting to Albanize them. The global academic community is clear in this regard. These churches and monasteries are Armenian. An independent scientific scrutiny may easily verify it. Construction style and old Armenian scripts on the walls of the churches prove the belonging of those churches to the Armenian culture and tradition. Caucasian Albania was located north of Kura River, and very few Caucasian Albanian churches survive till our days, which all are located north of Kura in historical Caucasian Albania. Regions located south of Kura River were comprised of two Armenian historical provinces, Artsakh and Utik, and have been inhabited by Armenians for at least 2,000 years. Not only ancient Greek, Roman, medieval, Arab, and Persian historians records prove that, but also the extensive vast archaeological sites and millennia-old churches with inscriptions written in Old Armenian or in Karabakh. There is not any Caucasian Albanian building or church or monastery, inscription or archaeological material found in Artsakh. The sole aim of such a policy is to erase all traces of Armenians' presence in their historical lands and deny any right of Armenians to live in their homes. A clear attempt of an ethnic cleansing, obviously a war crime. International community has also voiced its concern regarding the protection of the cultural heritage in and around Nagorno-Karabakh. On December 3, the heads of delegations of the OSCE Minsk Group co-chair countries, foreign ministers of Russia and France, Deputy Secretary of State of the United States, issue in their joint statement concerning Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in the aftermath of the war, also underscored the importance of protecting historical and religious heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now about our activities in the committee of the second protocol. With the support of France and our strategic ally Russia, which are, as I mentioned, Minsk Group co-chair countries, the committee adopted a declaration on ensuring cultural property protection in and around Nagorno-Karabakh and setting up an independent technical mission. The mission was proposed by the Director General Audrey Azoulay in her November statement after the meeting with the permanent delegates of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia gave its consent to organize and facilitate the mission's visit to the region. However, Azerbaijan fervently sticked to its cultural genocidal policy, is still creating artificial obstacles to the realization of the mission's visit. The negotiations are still ongoing in this regard. I would like also to emphasize the important role Russia and France play in the protection of Armenian cultural heritage. Presidents Putin and Macron, since the end of the war, have been making serious efforts towards the protection of Armenian Christian heritage in Artsakh. Thanks to the Russian peacekeepers, Armenian pilgrims have a safe access to famous medieval Armenian monasteries of Dadivang and Amaras. Additionally, as a committee member, Armenia initiated a draft decision with a view to enhance the work of the committee and to reinforce its capacities to proactively intervene in time of peace, during and after the armed conflict. After some discussions with the Secretariat, we agreed on a draft decision to be presented by the Secretariat, which would cover issues raised by us, namely the necessity to create monitoring and supervision mechanisms for the implementation of the second protocol. As a result, the committee adopted a decision on monitoring and supervision mechanisms for the implementation of the second protocol. The decision implies establishing an open-ended working group composed of the members of the committee and relevant experts, tasked with the assistance of the Secretary to develop and submit proposals on the possible interpretation and application of Article 27 of the second protocol, through the defining the scope of the concepts of monitoring and supervising, as well as providing concrete means of implementation of these functions, including proposed amendments to the guidelines on a monitoring and supervision mechanism to improve the protection of cultural property, introducing, among others, the monitoring of the state of protection of cultural property for their examination by the committee. Currently, the formation of the working group is underway and coordinated by the Convention Secretariat. Azerbaijan's effort to undermine UNESCO's and other specialized international governmental and non-governmental organizations' involvement in Nagorno-Karabakh goes against the will of the international community. Such behavior demonstrates that the same ill-intentioned policy of Azerbaijan is still underway, which does not contribute to reconciliation, in which OSCE Minsk Group countries backed by the international community are investing much, but rather creates new tensions in the long run. Emboldened by Turkey, the Azerbaijani government's such behavior and actions show that it is not interested in genuine peace and has far-reaching aggressive goals concerning both Artsakh and Armenia. There have been numerous statements on behalf of many international organizations on the urgency to take necessary steps towards preservation of Armenian heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh after the committee declaration. On January 20, the European Parliament adopted annual reports on the implementation of common foreign and security policy and common security and defense policy. In those documents, the Parliament highlighted that the security of the Armenian population and its cultural heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh must be ensured. Relevant ministries and agencies of Armenia and Artsakh closely cooperate with each other in this regard, and we are making sure that Artsakh's voice is heard in the international fora, in UN, UNESCO, and other international organizations. Here, I would like also to speak a little about the role of cultural heritage professionals and museum professionals, very brief. Cultural heritage and museum professionals play an important role in conducting research and documenting cultural heritage in Artsakh. As the impartial professionals committed to high academic ethics and scientific standards, their reports, books, research articles are crucial in upholding the truth in the face of the destruction and history falsification campaign run by the Azerbaijani officials. It is deplorable that the government in Azerbaijan deprives its academic community from the freedom and uses them to produce a false and mythical history appropriating cultural heritage of other nations, not only Armenians, but other nations in the region as well, namely Iranians, Georgians, and Udi people, and others. Everyone knows that there are many buildings, architectural buildings and mosques which belong to the Iranian culture, or churches, Georgian churches, where are dubbed as Caucasian Albanian as well. So cultural heritage professionals worldwide should continue their highly valued work and cooperate with all other academics in all countries. So this is the overall current situation in the political context and steps undertaken by the ministry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Artur, for that presentation. That was very helpful to see all the different projects. So I think now we'll try to do a little bit of Q&A. I'll check the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in. Maybe I'll start with, to pick up on some of the stuff that you mentioned, Artur, about the Caucasian Albanian issue for Fionnuala. So there's destruction by physically destroying the site, an object, and then there's destruction by changing the site or the object. So when Azerbaijan identifies some Armenian sites as Caucasian Albanian or removes scriptures, is there legal protection that addresses that kind of destruction specifically, where the site is maintained, but it's changed, so its meaning is destroyed?
It's a really interesting problem, actually, because of course, a lot of the earlier treaties about destruction, but what that means to different people changes, because I think in this case, we're not necessarily talking about physical destruction. It's the meaning of the site or the object and the integrity of it. And actually, Azerbaijan's national law, it does actually address this, and it prohibits this in their law on culture and their monuments law, and it actually specifically addresses that sites, you can't change their aesthetic appearance, and you can't carry out repair, construction, and this would include removing inscriptions. And there's also express prohibitions related to changing the heritage of different ethnic groups and different communities. So they do actually recognize this in their national law. But of course, it's really how they they perceive it, because they're the ones to enforce this law. And they would, of course, say that this is not what they're doing, because, as we've heard, the arguments are that, you know, they consider that these sites are not Armenian. So again, I'm echoing the importance of the heritage professionals here, and I think a way forward is not to push a debate about declaring something as Armenian or Albanian Caucasian, but I think the priority is to get these protected, and so they are not touched by anyone. So then the heritage professionals can really produce evidence to explain and educate the history, because this is very kind of, you know, important. There's a lot of materials and a lot of work that's been done that's not necessarily accessible to lawyers or to politicians. So I think the most important thing is that these are identified and protected in the first instance. I was quite encouraged because in January of this year, the UN actually adopted a resolution, and they've called for greater efforts across all countries to condemn converting of religious sites and objects. So they've brought this issue to the forefront, and it wasn't necessarily related to Nagorno-Karabakh. It was introduced by some of the Arab member states, but it was adopted without a vote, and there's going to be a conference, I think, towards the end of the year, where all states are going to be encouraged to make the utmost effort to protect religious sites and objects, which includes not converting them and damaging their integrity. So this is a real issue that's been highlighted internationally, and I think that's something that has got to be a priority really for these types of sites and objects.
Thank you. That's very interesting. For Professor Watenpaugh, obviously these issues are very politicized at the moment, and it's hard to see, Till also touched upon this, it's hard to see kind of how that could change. But are there examples you can think of where post-conflict, or models where post-conflict cultural heritage has become a medium for dialogue, or not so politicized?
Thank you, Tallene, for your comments, and thank you all the panelists for your important contributions. Obviously, we're talking about a situation where the wounds are very raw, and even literally very raw, and there's ongoing violence. It's a very, very difficult situation. So looking at good models where after similar or after other kinds of conflicts, have groups been able to find ways to move forward. One example that is frequently mentioned is the example of the Bicommunal committee in Cyprus that began as a very simple effort by Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots to work out some very basic issues about sewage and infrastructure and other very practical issues, and has evolved to provide a model for the two communities very locally working together to solve local issues having to do with cultural heritage. And some very good progress is being made. It has not been easy. And of course, in their situation, the conflict did not just end yesterday, it ended many years ago. And they're also in a very different European context. So it's very difficult to compare. But some of the things that's important for us to note is that in that case, it was the effort of the local groups, local leaders, and they started talking to each other. And they started talking to each other on very specific local issues related to practical things. Everything can be beginning. Of course, it hinges on the goodwill of both parties. So if you have one party that does not have goodwill or is intent on pursuing certain kinds of policies that make it very difficult to talk, these kinds of processes are very, very vulnerable to political pressure. So I think it is, I think it was Till who said that it's very ambitious to think about issues of dialogue and reconciliation right now. Yes, it is, but it's also incredibly important to have that as an end goal and not further punishment, further revenge, further spiraling into things that can be uncontrollable. So I think it is very important to speak about these ideals of cultural heritage as the property of all humanity, as a common good, and how important it is to preserve all aspects of the biography of a building. And here, I would question what is a fake inscription? What does that mean? If there's an inscription on a building, I don't care when it was placed there. It is part of the life of that building. It's an opportunity to understand how that building was meaningful to the many communities that lived there. So I think we are in a very dangerous time, and it's very difficult to think about issues like dialogue when the violence continues. But at the same time, it is more vital than ever to keep that as a goal and to articulate it very clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Heghnar. Let me see, there are some questions here. Can the speakers comment on the current status of these priceless pieces and places? I don't know who's best positioned to do that.
I'll jump in to say that in most cases we don't have accurate information because no one is there to record and monitor it. And that's why, as Artur mentioned, these monitoring efforts and these monitoring missions are so critical because we want to have eyes on the ground. For places like Dadivank and Amaras, because of the special agreements that have been made to have Russian peacekeepers there, it's possible to know what's going on, though I would prefer to have that even more thoroughly documented, especially the presence of military installations. How are they affecting, centuries-old buildings, issues of, seismicity, and so on. But in other cases, like some of the objects that I showed, we have no idea, and we are seeing these on social media that document these destructions, and it's impossible to get more information or verify them or have more complete information. So the fact that Azerbaijan continues to find ways to not welcome monitoring groups is of tremendous concern, and it does not look good. I mean, if you have nothing to hide, why are you preventing people from coming in? It's a very fluid and very dangerous situation. And that's why satellite monitoring is one of the things that one can do when one is denied presence on the ground. Satellite monitoring becomes a way to see if there's any change. It has its own limitations and it's extremely expensive. So that's why what the Avocats Foundation is doing is I think going to be critical.
There are a couple of questions about whether the sites in Karabakh have been documented, if they've been recorded, pictures have been taken.
Yeah, I'll jump in very quickly, and maybe Artur wants to add things. So we are so grateful to the generations of scholars from the Soviet period onwards who have documented these sites. And when the working group that I am part of, we began to gather these materials, we are almost overwhelmed with the amount of materials that there are. There are very serious studies and there are records going back to the 19th century, photographic and others, verbal descriptions, everything. So one of the challenges that we're facing, and we're also grateful to the Ministry of Culture and Sports for their help and guidance, and also our colleagues in Arts Group, which exists in many different formats and in many different languages, available and digitized and available to all. So we want to build a reliable database of accurate research materials on all of these sites.
Yes, all sites are well documented, and the lists exist, and the Ministry of Culture, Education, Culture and Sports of Armenia, in cooperation with us and other colleagues on the ground, have completed the list. And I would here also like to mention the Foundation of Research on Armenian Architecture, late Mr. Samvel Karapetyan. He did a spectacular work on this, so all the necessary lists and information are at our hands.
And I want to mention, this is very important, that Samvel Karapetyan, the late Samvel Karapetyan and his colleagues, they documented all cultural heritage in Karabakh, not just Armenian. They had a universal approach to cultural heritage. They documented bridges, mosques. The mausoleum that I showed was documented by them. So they are an extraordinary group, and I want to make sure to mention them. Thank you.
We're running a bit out of time. There are still a couple of more questions. I don't know if you guys, the speakers, can see some of the questions.
So I think there's one addressed to me about considering Artsakh as peace, not war, no peace, although no war declaration as well. So when we're talking about conflict and talking about it as this sort of strictly legal interpretation, because the Hague Convention sets out what is considered an international armed conflict, and depending on whether you're in that definition or not, it determines what the obligations are. So unless it meets all of the criteria of an international armed conflict, then those provisions won't apply, which is why it's so important to focus on the peacetime obligations as well, because what you sort of need to avoid is when there's negotiations, such as the second protocol meeting, if Armenia, for example, focus on all the violations alleged of conflict provisions, and then the international community turn around and say, well, that's fine, but you're not in a conflict situation, so there's no violation. So it's really important to focus on the technicalities, as frustrating as it is, and I completely appreciate that on the ground and to people affected, being told that the situation is not a conflict situation, it is very, very frustrating. But the reason that we're focusing so specifically on that is really to show what the violations have been to the international community. So it really is thinking like a lawyer rather than thinking about the situation in reality. So that's why that distinction is there. So I hope that answers that question a little.
May I add something about this? When we are talking about Nagorno-Karabakh, whether the conflict is over or not, we should ask ourselves, are the root causes of the conflict addressed or solved? Armenia believes not, and not only Armenia. OSCE Minsk Group countries in their statements, recent statements, both the head of delegations and co-chair representatives, they emphasize that the the negotiation should be continued under the auspices of Minsk Group until the final resolution of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. So it means that the problem is not solved, and there are still a lot of steps should be undertaken in this regard. Yes, hostilities ended, but the core problem is not solved, unfortunately. And Armenia thinks that the final peace should address all issues and meet and respect the interests of all parties. And forceful change of status quo cannot lay ground for sustainable and long-term peace.
Thank you. I think we've run out of time. There are still some more questions, but I encourage you to kind of reach out to the panelists or to the Armenian Bar, and we can try to see if we can answer those questions. Again, I want to thank our panelists. This was very interesting, very educational, and very important. And thanks to everyone who participated and co-sponsored the event.